It had been more than half a year since the virus had been discovered. Entire villages in Africa had been evacuated as the people fled. Scientists did note that the virus only spread along the coastline. They explained this by the likely possibility that the various forms of travel, including ships, were to blame. Trade routes along this coastline were altered to assure no spread in the west would occur. The rapid spreading now started to show color within Western countries as some politicians came under fire as the press wanted to know what countermeasures would be taken. The United Nations promised it would start research for a possible antidote and stricter policies to avoid spreading to countries in other continents. However, they pressed the fact that before this could happen, it was urgent to see to the issue the possibility of the virus spreading to larger nearby countries like Algeria, Libya, or Sudan. A spread to countries of that size could have catastrophic consequences. With the issue of the spreading virus in Africa getting some attention, politicians in various countries saw this as an opportunity to push their own agenda without risking doing it in full view. Whether it was Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, who aimed to restore trust in his own system, thereby boosting the conservative, social democrat, and libertarian parties, or Prime Minister Tony Blair, who also strengthened his own political power by vitalizing Westminster. He said this was a necessity for the earlier announced plans on focus of economy. In Africa, the mood was quite different. The countermeasures taken by some leaders came to no surprise, as Libya's dictator Muammar al-Gaddafi promised to fight off the spreading of the virus by protecting its borders with violence if need be. A focus on artillery was set in motion, as were similar actions performed by his neighbor president Hosni Mubarak. Rather than artillery, Mubarak would focus on its own army and infantry. Both used the spreading of the virus as a motive, but internationally, it was feared that these were also actions to strengthen their own position even more. In Australia, the issue of the virus was the least of their worries. The games were around the corner, and John Howard prepared the final touches on improving the docks and harbour infrastructure so that the country was ready to receive all incoming tourists. Other countries like Russia and China also did not seem to worry about the virus. The distance between them and the center point of the current infected area was so big that their politicians assumed a solution would have been made before it would reach their borders. Of course, this was not what they outed to the public. Both leaders settled for a focus on industry, with Chinese President Jiang Zemin going down a steady path to strengthen his own political party. In Holland, people started to ask questions that the announced focus on civilian industry should be exchanged for military focus. The reason for this was Tony Blair's break of promise to invest in the economy, but rather going back to a military investment. Blair realized his actions would have consequences in his popularity, but nonetheless continued with the path he began at the beginning of this year. Dutch Prime Minister Wim Kok assured the people of Holland that he and close partner America would keep a sharp eye on Prime Minister Blair's actions from now on. The same negative publicity came to the doorstep of French President Jacques Chirac, who thought that the increase in news of the virus would have the citizens begging for a better military structure. But the people let him know that this was not the answer, and Chirac promised to return to a focus of industrial development after the initial paperwork for the current military improvements had already been signed and executed. Then halfway through August, the officials of the Russian Federation reported that the Russian Navy submarine K-141, designated name Kursk, had sunk in the Barents Sea 75 kilometers from the shoreline of the Kola Peninsula at roughly 11:30 a.m. The Russian Navy had publicly offered several explanations, including a collision or an attack by NATO submarine. The NATO General Secretary had already denied these allegations. The death toll stood at 118, which equaled the entire crew of K-141. Putin realized that before he could return to a focus on improving the country's industry, problems concerning terrorist attacks by Chechen extremists had to be dealt with. He averted to a policy where he appeased Chechnya to stop the attacks and at the same time still strengthen his own political position a tiny bit. In September of 2000, the virus had spread once again, and this time to 3 more countries, namely Guinea, Benin, and Mali, the first of the feared larger countries to be infected. Nigeria in response started a destroyer program to strengthen its navy, implementing strict rules on import, migration, and traffic with the neighboring countries. Nigerian President Goodluck Jonathan used the former published news on most of the spread occurring at the coast as a motive for the destroyers. Skeptics addressed the notion of Mali being infected without even having a coast. Then the world's gaze shifted as the Olympic Games were here and created, according to many, a welcome distraction from the situation in Africa. The 27th Olympic Summer Games of the modern era were held in Sydney from September 15th until October 1st of 2000. 199 nations competed, with the United States and Russia winning most medals. Hosting Australia came in 4th. The Games met global acclaim, with British journalist James Mossop remarking that any future Olympic Games would have to hold up to the standards set in Sydney. The Dutch Prime Minister began to feel pressure as the populace was split into those wanting to make military preparations in response to nearby countries, France and Britain. To appease these people, Wim Kok announced that money would be invested in the development of better artillery pieces. This way he could satisfy those crying for military focus, while still being able to stick to the path of industrial improvement through the form of resource focus. This would eventually lead to a possibility for Holland to start the production of resources themselves instead of relying mostly on the trade. Experts suggested this would greatly increase their position on the market and in political regard. Mid-October, the United States Naval Command reported that the destroyer USS Cole was attacked by the Al-Qaeda network, killing 17 American servicemen. American intelligence reports point to the government of Sudan as a possible supporter of the two attackers. This raised questions among the press which enemy to focus on. Was it foreign terrorists who had the reach, thinking power, and resources to perform attacks like this? Or were it the mindless zombies who had nothing but slow minions wobbling about? Politicians knew all too well that the motive of terrorism was a much more believable one to strengthen one's military position, which is what some exactly saw on the route Tony Blair was headed. It was announced that Blair would expand the Air Force in response to the USS Cole bombing. Blair was of the opinion that more security should be established in foreign countries where American and European countries were present. Tabloids and magazines called Tony Blair a warmongering hellraiser. French President Jacques Chirac did indeed come back on his promise to return to industrial development as he started to focus on northern industry. One of Bill Clinton's final moves was to re-establish the continuing support of Israel by America, therefore strengthening the bonds between the two countries. With the focus shifting slightly to a military one, Dutch Prime Minister Wim Kok felt it was in place to hire a political advisor, a captain of industry, Cornelis den Hollander, who would see to a more efficient way to build factories, infrastructure, and refineries. Besides this, the announcement was made that more improvements on self-propelled artillery were being researched. And finally, plans for a military force comprising of brigades and regiments from Amsterdam, Den Haag, and Apeldoorn were presented at the Royal Palace. The force would be led by General Nico Geers. November brought news of the zombie virus spreading eastward to Niger and Nigeria, but also Senegal was hit by the disease. But America was not paying any attention to that. For them, it was all about election day and the votes that needed to be counted. It was a spectacular race with an outcome that was too close to call until the very end. There had been reports that Gore had won the initial count, but eventually George W. Bush got away with the win. There were those who believed that the too close to call event was fabricated to keep the US citizens away from the problems in Africa. Algeria was all too aware that they were close to seeing a spread of the zombie virus in their own country. Their office was one of the first talking about strict policies to withhold the zombie virus from spreading. Behind the scenes, a proposal was made to close the borders. This would have drastic political consequences, but could also greatly decrease the chances on the virus being able to spread in Algeria. The issue was that in order for the proposal to work, enough military staff would need to be stationed at the borders. Algeria, at this moment, did not possess that military might. Neighboring Morocco came up with a similar plan, but did not intend to close its borders. Abdelaziz Bouteflika publicly announced that the forces would be stationed at the borders to keep the zombie virus out. Their borders were small compared to countries like Algeria, and therefore, the Moroccan official had every confidence in holding theirs. Gaddafi once again had set a new focus on increasing the army even more, which was to no one's surprise. With President Bush now having the reins, he promised to finish the plan set in motion by former President Bill Clinton on improving the relations with Israel. He promised, however, that after that was dealt with, Bush would set a focus on a military path in response to the zombie virus and increasing threat of terrorists after the reports of the USS Cole bombing. Bush got a lot of support from several states, but there were also plenty who felt uneasy with this military course. In Europe, some countries did not seem to heed the warnings on the zombie virus spreading, as Poland was focusing on improving its own infrastructure. Poland was always behind in terms of industry and manufacturing, and Aleksander Kwasniewski said in order to compete on the market nowadays, improvements needed to be done to Poland's infrastructure first and foremost. At the end of November, word had gotten out that the previously virus-free areas in the north of Ivory Coast had been infected as well. This meant that the initial hypothesis by experts was wrong, and that an antidote or solution could not be found in these regions. The thick jungle probably slowed the spread down, but in the end, it managed to find its way land inward.